Yeah, g'day everyone. I'm James Manson, Senior Research and Extension Officer from Southern Farming Systems, and it's great to be with you here online today. Weed management in the high rainfall zone has been improving in recent years, but the landscape is always shifting. We have new issues with herbicide resistance, but also new management options to integrate into our farming systems. So today we're going to focus on our pre-emergent herbicide options, focusing on annual ryegrass control, and we'll talk about wild radish too, if we have the time for it at the end. We're very glad to have Dr. Chris Preston with us again today. Chris is Professor of Weed Science at the University of Adelaide and is well known to us as an expert in integrated weed management who's fully across all the issues we face in the high rainfall zone. So welcome, Chris, and thanks for being with us here today.
Well, thank you for having me here, James. It's a showery and cloudy day here in Adelaide, and hopefully there'll be a bit of rain up the country.
Yeah, well, thanks again. So what's going to happen in this Q&A session is that I have 3 pre-prepared questions that we're going to pitch to Chris. I'll share a question at a time. Chris will respond, and then we'll open the floor to your questions. When everybody's had a chance to ask their questions, we'll move on to the next topic. So there's going to be 2 to 3 opportunities for you to ask questions, so don't wait to the end. Please start developing your questions now as you listen to Chris. You can send your questions in through the chat box on Zoom, and then I will read some of those out for Chris to respond to. So having introduced the session, let's get into it. Chris, here's my first question for you. Pre-emergent herbicides are an important part of integrated weed management systems in the high rainfall zone, and their performance varies with the product, the season, and how those 2 things come together. In particular, there have been some concerns in some places with the new product Overwatch, along with reports of it doing a good job on ryegrass. So, Chris, with all that in mind, could you please run us through the past season and explain why our herbicides did what they did?
Yes, thanks, James. So, yeah, one of the things that you mentioned was that different seasons, different things happen. And so I think it's really good if we actually have a bit of a look at how the season played out for us and then can talk about how the various herbicides performed and why we saw what we saw. So in terms of what the season was, mostly we had a bit of a late start to the season. We had a pretty dry summer period and fairly dry autumn, and a lot of growers did end up dry seeding or sowing on not too much moisture. So the soil profile that we had was a lot drier than we normally would have at sowing time. We also tended to have above average rainfall in June and July. They were pretty wet months across most of southern Australia, and so that's also been part of what happened this year. So when we think about how pre-emergent herbicides are working, we put them out on the surface, and we're relying on the rainfall to move them down to where they've got to be picked up by the weeds, and so that they control the weeds when they're germinating. What we don't want to do is to move them too far down, because that can end up in issues with crop damage, or as we saw this year, we can actually have some leaching of some of these herbicides, and their activity will decline because they've actually been pushed out of the profile. So as a whole, because of the way the season started, and that we had all that good rain after putting herbicides out, by and large, early ryegrass control was pretty good with just about every pre-emergent herbicide that was used. And certainly in some of the medium rainfall areas where we've really only had 2.5 months of rain and it's got dry, the herbicides have provided really good control of ryegrass through the season. I know in the higher rainfall regions that there's still some ryegrass to come. So that's the plus side, is that the way the season played out, we generally had pretty good control of ryegrass, and I haven't had too many complaints about herbicides not working. What we have seen, though, is we've seen some issues around crop safety with some herbicides. And what I'm going to do to talk you through that is I'm just going to talk you through some of the chemistry of the herbicides and what we have to understand around these particular products. So what I've got here is I've got a list of our main ryegrass pre-emergent herbicides that we're using. The second column's the trade name. So if you want to look at the ones you're using, you'll see them there. And I've got them sorted by their solubility. So we've got at the top, we've got things like Dual Gold and Butazan, which are highly water soluble. And part of the problem with these herbicides in the high rainfall zone is that we tend to lose them. They tend to get washed through the profile. Butazan more than Dual Gold, because the next column talks about their binding to soil components, particularly organic matter, and Butazan doesn't really bind very strongly. So it's a herbicide that we know well in the high rainfall zone that we lose pretty quickly. Down the bottom, we've got some of the herbicides that we've been really familiar with, propyzamide, Sakura, Avedex, those sorts of herbicides, and they've got relatively low water solubility. And they actually work pretty well in the high rainfall zone, largely because we don't lose them. They don't go too deep into the profile. And Avedex, of course, tends to stay right up the top where we need it, because it's actually picking the weeds up as they push through it. In the new products that we've got, Luxamax and Overwatch, they're in that middle space. Luxamax is more water soluble than Overwatch, and it also binds less to organic matter. So Luxamax, we know we can get into trouble with in high rainfall situations, particularly on light soils. And certainly, where it was used this year in dry seeding or seeding with minimum moisture, we did have some issues. So that brings me back to that story about what moisture we have in the ground compared to what happens next. And I think that this is probably one of the small missing pieces in our understanding of how these herbicides are working. So if we've got dry conditions, we have no moisture in the soil or little moisture in the soil. When it rains, that moisture from the rainfall moves rapidly through the soil profile. And if it's moving rapidly through the soil profile, it'll take the herbicides with it quite rapidly, because they don't have time to interact with anything else. They don't have time to interact with the organic matter or the soil particles. And so they get pushed down further. We've already got a full profile like we had last year, and we used Luxamax. We didn't see a lot of damage except on the lighter soil types, because as the rain came, it started to move the Luxamax into the soil profile, but then the water from the rain met the water in the moisture was already in the soil, and they started mixing. And that mixing actually slowed down the movement of the water through the profile, which gave the chance of Luxamax then to interact with all the soil particles and slow its movement down again. So for the products like Luxamax and Overwatch, the big thing we've got to watch out for is if we don't have moisture in the soil, or if we're on those lighter soil types. So thinking about that and thinking about how things work this year, I'm just going to stop sharing that and get back on. So what we saw, certainly in better soil types and where the seeding system was good and people didn't go too fast and didn't throw soil into the next furrow and didn't have furrows collapse and those sort of things, we didn't really see a lot of issues with Luxamax on those better soil types. It was really only on the light soil types. Moving on to Overwatch, and I think the big discussion this year has been about Overwatch, so I'll concentrate the rest of my remarks on that. So what happened? Well, there are a number of things that happened. So we had the seasonal conditions that I've just explained. People used it on barley. I was out there telling everybody to use on barley, but given the lack of good products for ryegrass control in barley, it was a natural place for people to want to use Overwatch. Barley is not as tolerant as wheat to Overwatch, and we knew we were going to get crop effect, and we've certainly seen crop effect on wheat. And in our trials, we'd seen quite significant crop effect on wheat, but we'd always seen the crop grow out of it. With barley, it was always going to be slightly more risky. What did happen is because we had that dry soil, when it did rain and we got a lot of rain, it pushed that herbicide further down than it normally would. And so the crop picked up more of the herbicide. So we got a more extensive bleaching. And then what happened through June and July is we had those quite showery conditions. So not so much lots of big dumps of rain, but lots of days of 1 to 2 millimetres. And that meant that we actually didn't have a lot of sunshine. And what we're relying on Overwatch in terms of crop safety is that we'll get that bleaching, and those leaves that get bleached, they never recover. The bits that get bleached never recover. What we're relying on is the crop to produce new green leaves. And because the herbicide doesn't move from the old leaves to the new leaves, those new leaves won't be affected by the herbicide unless it picks up some more. But as we had that showery weather, not a lot of sunshine, crops grew really slowly. And this meant that we had that extended period of bleaching. And I certainly took a lot of phone calls during that period. People were talking to me, it was weeks of bleaching in some cases. That was all about the weather conditions that we had. In a different year, we'd have actually seen recovery a lot faster than that. Now, most of the crops have recovered. Calls I've taken recently from people have said, oh yeah, look, ryegrass control's good, crop's looking good, it's come back, and they're pretty happy with where things are. We did see some more significant crop damage, and all the examples that I've seen of that have been around seeding systems and some very particular soil types. And the seeding system, I think, is the big one that we can do something about here. So the issues that I've seen where we've actually lost crop stand, and that's where you're going to lose yield, so we don't have the whole crop up, have been where seeding's been too shallow. People have used disc seeders with barley. People have used knife points and harrows and have dragged soil back into the furrow, or people rolling paddocks after sowing and pushing soil into the crop furrow. And then we've seen a few soil types where it's been difficult to get even seeding, particularly if the soils are a bit hard, or some of those sort of gravelly type soils where we get a little bit more movement of rainfall and herbicides. We've seen some issues. So I think going forward, how do we handle Overwatch on barley? I think the key message is the safest way to do it is knife points and press wheels. Anything that puts that herbicide on top of the crop seed is likely to cause you some extra crop damage, and that's when risk comes into it. So I think the knife point press wheel system been pretty robust for these herbicides, and certainly our trial work with even Luxamax in the high rainfall zone has shown that if we do that and we get the speed right and we keep the herbicide out of the crop furrow, we don't actually have a problem in our better soil types. So, James, I think that's the opening remarks I wanted to say, fairly extensive, but I'm happy to expand on that in the chat conversation.
Thanks very much, Chris. That was, very interesting. Learned a few things there. Now's the time, everyone, to enter your questions into the chat. I'll be reading a few of those out as they come through. But just to get things started, Chris, I have a question of my own. You talked about how when the soil moisture is, or the soil is already fairly moist and there's a bit of moisture in the profile, that can slow down the descent of herbicides through the profile as it meets that moisture somewhere in the middle. We've had pretty bad waterlogging in some places in this year with standing water in paddocks in sort of, June in some cases. How's that affecting herbicide efficacy?
Well, it's waterlogging's, it's actually a bit of a problem with pre-emergent herbicides for a couple of reasons. One of which is that some of the soluble products, and we certainly see this with Luxamax, for example, that it's soluble enough that that'll actually, when you get that water across the paddock, that'll actually wash into the crop row, and you can get issues from herbicides there. So one of the things I think is that paddocks that do get waterlogged, we really need to take more care with our more water soluble product, particularly where we don't have good crop safety. The other issue of waterlogging, of course, is that it slows down crop growth. And for all of the pre-emergent herbicides that we play with, what we really want to have happen is we want to have our herbicides out there, control that first flush of ryegrass. We want that crop to bounce out of the ground and really get moving. And so waterlogging there, we can have waterlogging damage, we can have added herbicide damage to the waterlogging damage, and then the ryegrass gets away because ryegrass doesn't care about waterlogging. And certainly we've had issues in the past with some of the more water-soluble products and waterlogging basically taking the whole crop out. So I think if you've got those paddocks that do get waterlogged, you really want to be sticking from a pre-emergent herbicide point of view in those paddocks to some of the less water-soluble products that are not going to move as much.
Excellent. Thanks very much, Chris. Have we got any questions from the floor? That's okay. Feel free to keep working on those questions, and we'll be continuing the story with pre-emergence to the next question. So your questions from the first part might be relevant here still. Chris, the second question is, as we move forward with the new herbicide options you've spoken about and new ones coming, new herbicide resistance challenges, how should we be thinking about our pre-emergent strategies for the high rainfall zone?
Just moving on to the next slide. So this is some really old data, but I'm showing it again. This was some trial work that we did with the various farming systems groups back in 2012, 2013 in the high rainfall zone. And what we were interested in here is, in that high rainfall zone, how do we actually make those pre-emergent herbicides do the job that we need to keep ryegrass numbers down across the season? So what we've got here is reduction in the ryegrass seed heads going from 0 to 100. And there's a whole range of different herbicide options along the bottom, but they're kind of grouped. We've got herbicides used alone, we've got herbicides mixed with Avidex, and then we've got herbicides where we're followed by Box of Gold. And this was, some of the data that that sort of spurred moving into that early post Box of Gold use pattern. And what I really want you to do is to focus on the spread of the numbers. Okay, the dots, how far they spread. It doesn't really matter which of the herbicides we used alone. We had a lot more spread with those than when we did other things. So even Sakura on its own, Sakura in those days, we would get really good control. We still do, but it was between 60 and 99%. But that's still a pretty big spread. As we started to add Avidex Extra, we actually improved the herbicide performance, and we had less spread. That one right down the bottom there with trifluralin, that's an intensely trifluralin resistant population in South Australia, so that's a bit of an outlier for obvious reasons. And then when we went to the adding Box of Gold afterwards, particularly for things like trifluralin and Sakura, we tightened that up again. So I think the point I want to make is that these rules still apply. So in the high rainfall zone, using a single pre-emergent herbicide and expecting to get control for most of the season is unrealistic. Certainly all the work that I've been doing over the last decade with Southern Farming Systems and the McKillop Group in the high rainfall zone, we've been looking at stacking pre-emergent herbicides together, whether we mix them or whether we use early post options. So we'll just stop sharing that and I'll get back on. So when we're thinking about that, we're still wanting to do that mixture or sequences, but we've got new products in. So how do we actually use those new products in the system? One of the things I think to remember about the high rainfall zone is that in the high rainfall zone, our best pre-emergent herbicides from their chemistry point of view are the ones that have got lower solubility. So those really highly soluble ones like butazan are just, not really going to do the job that we want, no matter what we do with them. We struggle with Box of Gold because it's got a little bit too much solubility for us. It doesn't last long enough. So we're really wanting to make sure that when we go out and we do those mixtures and sequences, that we have one of those products in there that's got that lower solubility and so it's going to stay where we want it to stay in the environment, even if we put something with it that's got a little bit of extra water solubility. So some of the things that we've been doing in the recent trial, what we're doing has been looking at, if we bring Overwatch into the system, because we need some new modes of action. If everybody in the southern farming system area just uses Sakura in wheat, we know where we're going to be. We're going to end up with resistance to Sakura, and there, what are we going to do next? So we want to bring these other products in and find ways to use them that are going to be effective. And certainly, the work we've been doing, we've been looking at how do we mix Overwatch, and the options that have really been successful for us have been things like Avidex Extra, because it's a really good mixing partner because of its behaviour, but also Sakura. That doesn't take the pressure off Sakura, but I think it gives you an option of doing something around ryegrass, maybe in the next crop doing something different. Then when we look forward, I think one of the things that's coming is Matino Complete. And this is a mixture of Sakura with diflufenican and a new active ingredient. And we've been playing around with Matino Complete and trying to determine what we can do with it. And I would say that used as an IBS, its behaviour for ryegrass control is just like Sakura. Sakura's doing all the work for ryegrass control. You get a little bit of extra control of weeds like wild oats and brome grass from the other components in there. But the other components at that stage are not really doing a whole lot for ryegrass control. So it may not be IBS is the best place to put it in the high rainfall zone. What we've been looking at is we've been looking at an early post-emergent application. So Bayer had been thinking about an early post-emergent application of this product. Their original thinking about that was that that would give you some broadleaf weed control, and so there'd be an advantage there. And we started saying, well, actually, can we get some extra ryegrass control out of doing that? Because one of the things we struggle with is we put Box of Gold out early post, and it really only lasts 3 or 4 weeks, and in the high rainfall zone, which we just still have too much of the season left. Whereas if we can get 8 weeks out of an early post, that's going to get us into about the space we want to be, where we can stop some of that later ryegrass from coming up and causing problems. So we've been looking at that as an option. And what you can't do with that is have Sakura up front and then come back with Matino Complete, because that's just going to be too much Sakura in the system, and that'll cause you some crop effects and some residual effects. And so we're not going there, but we're looking at how do we put other products. And I think that what we can do over that is that we can actually use the whole range. We've had quite good success of using things like Troflor and Avidex first, and then coming back with Matino Complete, all the way to using Overwatch first and coming back with Matino Complete. So there's a range of strategies that we can use along that area to get as much control as we possibly can, depending a bit on rainfall and where the season's sitting as to how we're working, and indeed how much farmers want to spend on pre-emergent herbicides. And so there are some new products available, but they do come with some challenges about how we use them. We know, we can use Luxamax in the right sort of system. We do want to, if we do want to mix it, we're going to be restricted with things like Prosolvacarb or Avidex Extra or Trifluralin. We can't use Sakura there. I don't know that I'd take the chance of mixing it with Overwatch either. 2 products that both cause crop damage is always a bit of risky business, particularly if they're both water soluble. So I think we want to be thinking about, well, with these new products, where can we actually fit them in the system? So we take some pressure off some of the old products, but how can we still do this, using a couple of modes of action in that pre-emergent herbicide space? So over to you, James.
Thanks, Chris. Yeah, that's all very helpful. We have had a couple questions come in, so we'll start with the first one that I've got here. Overwatch is registered for 3 crops, so I think this person is thinking about using it across a rotation, and is asking, is there any issue with added residues in the soil if, for example, you were to use Overwatch 2 years in a row, for example? Do we have any concerns about Overwatch residue persisting for the next crop? Say we're coming back with a barley after having used it on something else.
Look, I think in the high rainfall zone, James, that's not something that we would normally be concerned about. We're going to probably run into some issues with residues of Overwatch in the lowest rainfall zones. But the high rainfall zone, it's residual, but it's not that residual. So we're not talking about a lot of residual into the next year. So I think that we'll still be all right. If you wanted to use it 2 years in a row, that could be something that you could do without getting into too much trouble. However, I will caution that, we do have resistance risks around Overwatch. So, we've already ourselves selected some Overwatch resistant ryegrass. So it can be done. This was a population that was resistant to most of the other pre-emergent herbicides I point out. So I'm going to be saying, look, we want you to use Overwatch, but we want to use it in the best spot in your rotation. We don't want you to be using it in every crop in the rotation. And we're certainly getting some new products for other parts of the rotation that are quite handy. So, we're getting some new pre-emergent, or have got some new pre-emergents for canola in the propamide. We've got some new products for pulses. So we have quite a range of pre-emergent herbicides we can use. So I don't think we need to say, oh, look, we want to, use Overwatch 2 years out of 3. I'd be going, look, let's put it in where we need it. For some people that'll be canola, for some people that'll be barley, for other people, it might be wheat, but not think about using it in multiple crops.
Yeah, excellent. And I think that the question was just taking that as an example, not necessarily advocating that 2-year use either. But yeah, that's good to know that we're not so worried in the high rainfall zone about carryover. So that's really good. I have another question here about, you've mentioned how the knife system is generally better used with the pre-emergent options, particularly some of those new ones. Could you comment on strategies moving forward with disc seeders? There are lots of people interested or using those. So any words of wisdom for moving forward with those systems, with the new products?
Yeah, James. Yeah, look, I think that's that's one of the areas where we are going to have some issues with some of this new chemistry that we've got. I think the things to remember about trying to use pre-emergent herbicides with disc seeders is that, well, first of all, disc seeders aren't disc seeders, so you need to understand what your disc seeder's doing. So the rules are that if you throw herbicide out of the crop furrow with your disc seeder system, then you're going to get some crop safety. Even to the point, I mean, we've got did a pile of work using different disc seeder systems with pre-emergent herbicides, and we wrote a fact sheet on it so that you could, and that's available on our website, the University of Adelaide's website, so you can find that, and that'll give you some hints about how things set up. We got to the point where, if we got the disc seeder system seeding operation exactly right, got our crop depth right, threw enough soil out of the furrow, we could make any of the pre-emergent herbicides relatively safe, to the point where, in some of the setups we had, we didn't really have any crop damage with trifluralin. So it's about what your disc seeder does. So first of all, you need to, after you've done some sowing, go back and check and look at where the soil is. So is that soil still sitting on top of where you put the crop seed, or have you been able to move it out of that area and put it on there, some of it on the interrow? So it's herbicide treated soil sitting immediately above the crop seed that's the problem. Now, Then the second part of worrying about using products with disc seeders is about the solubility of products. Because you've got them sitting above the crop seed, anything that's got any level of solubility is likely to be dangerous, or more dangerous than things that don't. So, we know from our own work that most of the time we don't actually have an issue with using something like Sakura in our trials. And if you've got a product which has got a post-so pre-emergent or an early post-emergent application, I think that tells you that that's going to be relatively safe with a disc seeding setup. So they're products that are going to be options for you. So going forward, in terms of which herbicides you want to use in disc seeders, well, you're not going to use Luxamax in a disc seeder, so we'll just park that one. It's just too water soluble. You don't want to use butazan you're not going to use butazan in the high rainfall zone anyway. You don't want to use that in a disc seeder, so we'll push that one aside. I think Overwatch is going to be troublesome, and I wouldn't use it in barley, wouldn't use it in canola. But Matino Complete is probably where you're going to be thinking that might be the best option for wheat with the disc seeder, particularly if it has that early post-emergent application, because that might allow you to do something like put something really safe up front, maybe even just a bit of Avidex Extra, and then come back and really try and pick the weeds up with the early post application. So, changing the mindset of how you're using your herbicides, rather than deciding they've all got to go up front. We might have some options of putting some things in that early post space, and all we need to do is just hold the weeds back for that first couple of weeks. So I think that there is a little bit of light at the end of the tunnel. We're not going to get a lot of information about particular setups of disc seeders because they're all different. But the real thing to watch for is, where does that soil go? If it stays in the row, in the crop seed row, then that really limits your options in terms of what you can do in terms of pre-emergent herbicides.
Thanks, Chris. Just another quick question here. Someone wanted to ask, the Overwatch resistant population that you mentioned, that you also mentioned was resistant to a range of other products. Was that resistant or reduced sensitivity? Could you say a bit more about what that looked like?
Okay, so what we did was we had this population that was resistant to Box of Gold. It had some resistance to, or resistant to esmetolochlor, a little bit of resistance to Sakura, resistant to trifluralin, resistant to Avidex Extra. So, pretty wide spectrum of resistance. And we noticed that when we were testing it across a range of the newer pre-emergent herbicides, that we got some survivors to bixlozone. So we kept those and crossed those, and then looked at the population afterwards, and basically we couldn't control it with bixlozone at that point. It's not terribly strongly resistant to bixlozone at the moment, but it's enough that you would have a failure from using the rate that's available to us. So I think the thing to think about that is that we've done that. It's one of those weird populations. Not every population is going to be like that. We know because we know where that population we know the farm it comes from. It's had a very, very extensive history of continuous cropping and herbicide use. So 2 generations of farmers of continuous cropping, basically. So it's probably right at the forefront of what we're going to be seeing. So I expect that over time we will see some resistance to bixlozone. It may come sooner than perhaps we might have expected otherwise. And certainly we've seen this, say, with Box of Gold and with Sakura. We thought they were going to be quite robust, but once we started using them over large areas, we were able to find more for Box Gold, populations resistant. But we do have in our random surveys telling us that there's a fraction of a percent of Sakura resistance out there. So half a dozen populations that turn up. from time to time. So, all of the herbicides are at risk of resistance, and that population is a particularly strange population. So I think that if you've already got lots of resistance to the other products, is just keep an eye out for failures where you don't expect failures, and get some testing done. Make sure you control them so they don't set seed.
Thanks very much, Chris. We've just got a few minutes left. I'm told we have a few questions that could be addressed, but I think we might follow those up later now. So let's just maybe finish with a few comments on wild radish. It's similar to annual ryegrass in that it cross-pollinates, develops resistance quickly. It's also one of our big challenge weeds, but we're more facing that battle in canola and pulses. So what do you see as being key to getting right in wild radish management in our environment?
Well, I think what we learnt about wild radish management in the high rainfall zone is that it's if we're going to try and do it with herbicides, it's a 2-spray approach. We need to have something out early to keep radish numbers low and get them while they're small, and then we need something later to pick up those later emerging radish. So when we think about that, what we need is a combination of tactics to get radish. Now in canola, we do actually have lots of things that we can do. So we've got a range of herbicide tolerance in canola, and I think our thinking about that is, how do we employ that to make sure that we can have multiple goes at radish, because that's what we need to do. We probably need to have 2 in-season options, and then we need to try and do something at the back end of the season. So whether that's harvest weed seed control, which I know in the high rainfall zone with radish is not as effective as it is in Western Australia, but it does actually take some of the seed off the paddock, or crop topping. But we need to make sure we don't have really big radish getting to the back end of the season there. So that might be that you might want to be thinking then in the canola space about some of the dual tolerant canolas as being an opportunity to use 2 different modes of action against radish in the season, rather than just relying on a single herbicide. I think in beans, it's just so much more challenging. We don't have a lot of safe herbicides that give us radish control in beans. We've spent a long time, with turbine as being one of the main things that we've done. Reflex is going to give us an option to do something different. But in the in-crop space in beans, we really don't have anything fabulous. I mean, the only thing that we've really got in conventional beans is Ecopar, and so many things that you've got to get right to make that work. In the Bendoc beans, of course, we can use the IMI chemistry, but I know that that's going to be really attractive, but we do know that radish develops resistant to the IMI chemistry pretty quickly. So I think that that's a tool to use to get your numbers down, but it's probably not one to rely on for the long term. So I think, reflex is probably one of the things we're going to really start looking at in that bean phase, to give us that extra early control, and then we need to be thinking about what we're doing at the back end of the season. But I think it's just, it's annual ryegrass control in reverse. In annual ryegrass, we're trying to hold the line in cereals, and we're trying to get ahead in the break crops. With radish, we need to do it the other way around. We need to try and hold the line in our canola and favour bean crops, and we need to get ahead of the game in the cereal phase. So we need to make sure that our cereal control is excellent. So I think that involves that 2 herbicide applications, involves also looking at the back end of the season. So, do we get into harvest weed seed control just to try and get the radish numbers down so it doesn't muck us up in our break crops?